Thanks, Peter. Just to try and have a look at the aspects of form, we're going to look at a place called Somerstown, which a lot of you are probably familiar with. But for those of you who aren't, it's the area in red here. So this is the Euston Road. We have King's Cross St Pancras here and Euston Station here. So it's the area in between them that goes from the Euston Road all the way back up to Camden Town up here in the north. And just using the aspects of form, we're going to see, first of all, how this place developed, and then look at various examples which will hopefully highlight things a bit better. So just in terms of what Peter was talking about connections, well, the difference between connections and location, I suppose. Somerstown is actually very, very well located in that it is between two major rail terminals, or three major rail terminals. You can go to pretty much anywhere in London from the undergrounds. You can go to most places in the country from the national rail train stations. And of course, you can go to Paris, Lyon, and various places in Europe from the Eurostar terminal. As well as that, it's right in the centre of London. However, proximity doesn't equal connectivity, because you'll notice that south of Somerstown, the Bloomsbury area is a very, very rich area. There's very high quality buildings there. And if you just cross the Euston Road and go into Somerstown, it's completely different. Now, there shouldn't be that much difference because they are very, very close to each other, and they do have a lot of the same characteristics in terms of the advantages they have. However, Somerstown has deteriorated in recent years, mostly as a result of the train stations coming in and it becoming completely disconnected to the east and west, and also with the amount of traffic on the Euston Road, it's pretty disconnected to the south as well. And even going up to Camden Town at the north is quite difficult because of, there's only one or two ways out of it. And if you ever try to drive into Somerstown, you'll figure this out because it's pretty difficult to get into as well. So that's just by way of introduction. And just to kind of look at how all this came about, if we look at when we're talking about the context and the development of urban grain, a lot of that starts from field patterns and rivers that were there at the start. So this is the area of Somerstown marked in red there with the old field patterns. And if we just highlight a few things, what you'll see is there is an old lane that comes up here called Drummond Crescent. There's also the River Fleet, which is kind of defines the western or the eastern boundary of Somerstown. And there's this dotted line is a kind of a planned road, which they call the New Road, which is now the Euston Road. And then this Midland Road, which kind of went up to the north. So they were there originally. And what you'll see when the first plan was devised is that Drummond Crescent has remained in this form. So this lane was obviously there. It could have been there for hundreds of years, perhaps thousands of years. It's still there today. In fact, as we roll through these timelines, you'll see that one of the things remaining is still this lane here. And also the line of the River Fleet has been kept, defining that eastern boundary. So anyway, Somerstown was planned by Lord Somer, hence the name, and it was a tight grain, mostly housing. A lot of different people lived there. Huguenots came over first, and then it was inhabited by Spanish, and there was a lot of sort of movement of people. But at its time, it was quite a successful housing area. It would have been up there in terms of prosperity with places like Bloomsbury. However, later on in the 1890s, the railways came along, and you see Euston Station came in first, followed by King's Cross, St Pancras to the east and west there. And already you can see how these areas were just completely hemmed in, and you couldn't get from the east and west. You had to come right up over here to come across, but of course you can't come across because you have train lines coming there. So they're completely hemmed in here. They're completely hemmed in here. And the size of the blocks has increased from these sort of pretty manageable human scale blocks to something which is, 200 or 300 metres long. So looking further ahead to 2009, what's happened is these stations have gotten bigger. The British Library has come in. That was the old goods yard, but again, the British Library is another massive size block. It's probably not very human in scale in that, like, it has a big long blank facade on one side. The connections east and west haven't improved, but on top of that, there's been a lot of post-war housing introduced, which sort of breaks down the street pattern. So you see these housing blocks up here. The street edge is kind of eaten into a lot in that area, and as well down here. The only area that has survived basically intact is this top corner there. And if you look at the demographics of this area, you'll find out that that's where most people own their homes. That's where most people have permanent jobs, and that's where the least amount of people have moved out of the area. And it's also a conservation area. So it's just that kind of, that tradition. If you can build up, well, I suppose it's just that it was successfully built in the first place and hasn't changed much, whereas the rest of it has changed, and there's pretty obvious difficulties arising from that. Now, Somerstown was built on a grid pattern, and this is just a point about grids, and that I think people have this idea that they're boring places, but if we look at New York and Barcelona, they're two grids that are built on almost the same scale in terms of their plan of them. They're sort of, I think New York is like 80 by 120 metres. It's the size of their grid, whereas this is 80 metres by 80 metres. But they're similar enough in size, but they're obviously completely different cities. So just because it's a grid doesn't mean that it has to be a sort of a monotonous place. And this, just looking at this urban grain again, this is the western side of Somerstown. So this is just an extract from that map, and that is Euston Station, and that's the other side of the road. This is Eversholt Street, I believe. And this is the two sides of that street. So you can see one side has shops. It has buildings which are sort of 6 metre wide frontages, shops on the ground floor. The other side is about a 200 or 300 metre long frontage. It has no activity at the ground floor, and it's not impossible to sort of decide what side of the street to walk down or what side of the street would feel more safe at night or something like that. It's just much more pleasant and human-sized grain. The other thing we thought about was land uses, and land uses need to be, well, first of all, they need to kind of complement each other, and that's why we came up with this idea of the dominoes. So there are uses that work well together, and there are uses that don't work too well together. And uses as well have to work across two sides of the street. So this being the Euston Road, part of the problem is that you don't have complementary uses on both sides of the road, so there's no sort of no willingness, I suppose, to cross this road. You just kind of tend to stay under one side of the road, and that, of course, increases the sort of isolation of both of these sides. And again, sort of bringing a lot of the activity that is on Euston Road, if there was ways of bringing that back into Somerstown, it could diversify the place and improve the lives of its residents. Now, obviously, things like train stations, we do need them, and they are difficult to deal with. But if you take the case of Charing Cross Station, it does have a very successful ground floor. You can see it's an absolutely massive building and has hundreds of functions inside it, including a major railway station. But the ground floor has been very well done in that it feels like a human scale. The facade has been broken up into sort of manageable sized units, so it doesn't feel like you're walking along the side of Euston Station, for example. A similar situation that we have to deal with a lot these days is shopping centres as well. So this is Paradise Street in Liverpool. It's a major shopping centre, but it's not roofed, which is one thing. It feels like it's part of the city, and these big massive retail boxes have been wrapped around on the outside with shops which are smaller and feel like it's more of a city centre. But you have to kind of compare this with a shopping centre, because that's essentially what it is. This is like the aspirations of Brent Cross or something like that. That's what they've done up in Liverpool, and as a sort of in honouring it, it's been nominated for the Sterling Prize this year, which is the first master plan to have ever achieved that. So it really is a very successful place. Now, when we talk about street-making buildings, we don't always have to have buildings that are exactly the same. This is Golden Square here in London, and you can see that the buildings, there is a sort of a similar height to a lot of them. The window lines run on a similar height as well, so it does feel unified. However, the buildings themselves are obviously quite different, and that's one way of doing it. When you compare that with Bedford Square in London, which obviously has been made in one complete parcel, so it was all built at the one time, all planned at the one time, and the effect is it's quite striking. It's much more unified, but in terms of the space and what it feels like to be in the space, it's perhaps not that different from the previous example of Golden Square. It's really just a matter of having some sort of guidelines that to do with perhaps height of roof or height of window or something like that that might try and unify the space. So when we talk about density, people, I think, often have a sort of a strange impression. I think if you look at the middle one, that's probably the sort of scale that's in Somerstown. It was certainly originally in Somerstown. It's kind of been broken up after the war years to something a bit more like the top diagram there. But all these three diagrams are exactly the same density, and that's sort of the point to be made, that you can have high density and it doesn't necessarily mean tall buildings, because of course if you have tall buildings you have to have setbacks around the tall buildings to let light into the streets, etc., and to provide for car parking, and of course all that land is essentially could be built on in tighter grains with the same density, such as the image below there. The other thing we talk about is David alluded to earlier, is landmark buildings and I suppose street making buildings. So this icons and increments, the Peckham Library there in the top left corner is a very successful building. It's obviously quite a landmark. It's very unusual looking and it has great reviews. People who live in Peckham love it, and it does sit out there on its own. It's a building in space, like the Corbusian vision that David talked about from the 1930s. But there are kind of times and a place, if everywhere was like that, it would lose its appeal and it would lose its value as an icon building. Whereas if you take a building like City Lit down below, it's a very successful street making building. It follows the window lines of the buildings to the side of it there. It continues the street, and when it does turn a corner, as in the picture on the bottom left, it does make a feature of that, but again, it's not screaming at you, and that's I think the point. Like, we do need street making buildings, and I think as David says, like, we don't always need champagne. Sometimes good red claret is enough, and we should probably think about that when we're designing cities. In terms of landscape, the image on the right is from Somerstown, and that's one of the play areas in Somerstown, and you can see how well used it is because there's no basketball hoop on that basketball board. Also, the buildings surrounding green space, there's no doors, there's no access to that green space, so nobody really feels any ownership over it. You kind of, where your wall ends and the outside begins, that's somebody else's problem. So if you compare that to Vauban on the left-hand side of the page, where you're actually looking at the back of houses there, so they kind of share a sort of a communal back garden, and there's sort of a breakdown of public to private, and that the private, what's very private is behind these glass doors. Then there's sort of a layer which is where they keep all their outdoor tables, furniture, etc. like that, and then into the communal garden where everybody shares, and it's that kind of layering that can help, or it could certainly help in a situation like this. If you go to the front of these buildings, which is this here, this is the street that they're on, you see children playing there, because what they've done in Vauban is they have a very successful scheme whereby you're allowed drive in here, you're allowed to bring your cars and unload your shopping, but then you park your car elsewhere in a multi-storey car park, which is part of the neighbourhood. It's much better done than a lot of the car parks we've seen here. But what it does mean is that children can use the street. You see that the residents are using the street to plant stuff, and the children can use the street and be happily overlooked and feel quite safe doing it, which is something that happens in Somerstown, but nobody feels very good about it probably. Details and materials. The picture on the top left there is actually from Somerstown, and that's just an example of somebody has grown ivy over their house, and when you walk around, it is a sort of a landmark, as Peter was talking about earlier on, in that you could direct somebody to your house by saying, yeah, turn left at the house with the ivy. And it does kind of make the place a bit more special. It does make it feel a bit more owned. The building with the traffic there, the picture with the traffic there, where, that's just an example of sort of everyday good, hard landscaping. There's nothing special about that. It doesn't feel like it's you know, a place of national importance or anything like that, but it's very well landscaped, and you can imagine that it'll be very well looked after because people would feel a certain civic pride to that. Similarly, things like lighting is very important, and there are the odd sort of quirky things like the strip of pavement turned up there to form the seat. All this is, I mean, it's obviously stuff that moves on a quicker cycle than the street network and the transportation network, but it is very important in giving a sense of ownership and a sense of pride over places where you live. And it's generally not an expensive thing to do, but the rewards that you would get back are very, very important. So this is an image we made of Somerstown, and it's a collage really. It doesn't have, it's not a real place, but all these places are real places in Somerstown. So just trying to bring it all together to sort of show, you know, what this place has going for it and what it might be. So, you know, you have the British Library towers here. You have the towers from the estate in behind Euston Station. This Somerstown Coffee House, which is a very successful bar and restaurant in there. There's a listed housing building over here. There's good parkland, and there's good paving in a lot of it. And, you know, it does have a lot going for it. It's just, it's been a little uncared for over the years. So that's just a way of trying to look at the aspects of form through a real place and what they might become. And I think I'm going to hand over to Peter now, who's going to look at time.